The second blade came from the gallery rail, low and fast, aimed where her throat met her shoulder, and Corvus only saw it because the king moved first. Drake crossed the aisle before she understood what her body had registered, one hand at her back forcing her down behind the stone archivist table while his other hand caught the attacker's wrist hard enough to crack bone in the silent half-breath before chaos broke loose. The hearing chamber had been full of nobles in winter silk, and clerks with wax-stained fingers, people who had spent the last hour discussing her life as if she were a page entry, and now benches overturned and inkpots shattered and someone screamed her name like it had become a warning. One assassin fell with Ivo Hale's sword through his chest, and the second tried to wrench free from Drake's grip, failed, and chose to bite down on poison before any guard could force a confession. Two bodies, both dead before questions could start, and Corvus stared at the gray froth at the second man's mouth and knew this attack had never been meant to survive investigation. It had been designed to erase her in public and leave nothing. She pushed up on shaking arms because she had spent too many years learning that staying on the floor was how people decided your fate, and the chamber went still in the strange way rooms did when a predator decided something. Drake turned toward the assembled court, blood on his sleeve that was not his, and his voice cut through panic with that clipped authority everyone obeyed before they understood they had heard him. He invoked emergency sovereign custody and publicly claimed Corvus Thornwood as his protected mate under Crown law, effective immediately, not pending review. The room reacted like ice cracking across a lake, not all at once, with sharp little fractures of outrage and disbelief. Counselors looked to Kieran Thornwood for protest, because he was her father and still held a council seat. Kieran kept his eyes on the floor. Lydia's face went white, and then hard, the same expression she had worn the day she taught 12-year-old Corvus what public humiliation looked like when no one planned to stop it. Corvus heard none of what people said after that. She heard only Drake's earlier words from the Frost Court session, delivered in that same flat voice that never warned anyone he had already made a decision. You were born without a designation. That is the first interesting thing I have heard in 7 years. At the time, she had assumed he meant dangerous, inconvenient, suspicious, and she had been wrong about many things before, so the mistake had not felt new. Understanding why he said it would cost him an alliance, cost her anonymity, and tear open a fraud that had shaped 9 packs for decades, took everything that happened next. To understand why a king claimed a woman he had known for weeks, the story had to start in 2004, in a midwinter birth room where no one found the scent mark they were expecting. Corvus was born during a storm that closed the pass roads for 3 days, which meant the local clerk recorded her before central examiners could arrive. In Thornwood records, she entered as late-onset designation pending, a phrase people used when they wanted uncertainty to sound ordinary. Her mother died when Corvus was 6, and by then the phrase had become family habit, repeated in polite rooms until it felt less like a lie and more like postponement. Lydia was already learning court manners and bloodline arithmetic, taught to move through gatherings as if she belonged in every center. Corvus learned where to stand, so no one had to step around her. By custom, first stable shift brought designation right, and in 2016 Corvus stood in white linen before her pack shrine, while elders burned scent herbs and waited for mark and resonance. 12 years old, hands steady because she knew fear became gossip if anyone saw it. The rite produced nothing, no scent lock, no roll resonance, no claim marker. The officiant repeated the sequence twice, voice tight by the second cycle. People started whispering by the third. Lydia stepped forward before the officiant dismissed anyone and said loudly enough for the hall to hear that some bloodlines diluted when lesser stock was introduced, and if Corvus wanted a place, she could earn one by serving people who mattered. Kieran did not interrupt Lydia. He did not take Corvus home early. He spoke to elders about procedural alternatives while his younger daughter stood in front of the whole hall, with no designation and no advocate. That was the day Corvus learned the specific shape of her wound, not the abstract idea of rejection, the practical certainty that people who should protect you might call abandonment pragmatism and sleep fine afterward. Before that rite, she still believed family would overrule status when tested. After it, she could not believe that anymore, and that disbelief controlled every decision she made for years. Designationless in a system built on rank meant unprotected labor status once childhood exemptions expired. By 2023, Corvus was 19 and assigned courier routes nobody with leverage accepted, carrying sealed packets between hostile district offices where guards checked her bag and never her face. 9 packs answered to the crown, each with local clerks who controlled birth ledgers before central archive transfer, and Corvus's work put her in rooms where careless officials spoke freely in front of someone they did not count. She learned seals, signatures, witness bands, transfer stamps, the small mechanics that turned a rumor into a legal fact. She learned where records disagreed. People assumed humiliation would make her quiet. It did the opposite in narrow, costly ways. On a late autumn route, she found a junior messenger from Cedar Pack beaten behind a storage shed because he had challenged an altered grain count. Corvus knew reporting it could get her route privileges revoked, which would drop her into bonded kitchen labor with no independent movement. She carried him to the infirmary anyway and wrote the incident in the public courier log under her own name. The steward docked her winter ration allowance for insubordination. She paid the cost and kept walking. That habit, telling the truth in spaces where truth made hierarchy uncomfortable, put her in Frost Court in early 2024. She had delivered witness packets for a sentencing hearing involving a mill foreman accused of colluding with raiders, and while waiting to be dismissed, she saw the presiding clerk present 3 witness seals she recognized as forged. The wax pattern belonged to an obsolete die retired 2 winters earlier, and she knew because she had carried the retirement notice herself. She could leave, protect her route, keep her head down, and let the foreman disappear into penal pits by morning. She stood up instead and asked permission to inspect the seals aloud. Interrupting a royal session without summons carried penalties ranging from whipping to prison transfer depending on judge temperament. Corvus felt every eye in that room turn toward her and looked straight at the table anyway, because fear had never been the hard part. Acting while afraid had been the hard part, and she had practiced. Marshal Ivo Hale moved first, procedural as weather, crossing toward her with hand near sword hilt while waiting for the king's signal. Drake sat above them on the blackwood dais, expression unreadable, and gave one slight nod that allowed her to approach the evidence stand. Her fingers shook once when she lifted the first seal. She said exactly what she saw. Obsolete die groove at the left edge, witness braid mark copied from a prior quarter registry, and she named the document she had carried, proving those seals invalid after renewal. She expected to be dismissed for impertinence. Drake ordered the court clerk to produce the renewal ledger. It matched her claim. The foreman's sentencing paused pending inquiry, and the room shifted from irritation to calculation so fast it made her skin crawl. People started measuring what this interruption meant for whoever had tried to push a false conviction through Crown session. Drake looked at Corvus as if hearing a language he remembered from somewhere else. "You were born without a designation," he said after confirming her identity from the roster. She nodded because the room already knew. "That is the first interesting thing I have heard in 7 years," he said, and ordered a private investigation into all Thornwood designation records. Corvus heard threat where the audience around her heard curiosity, and she had reasons for that misread. Power had rarely approached her without demanding silence in exchange for temporary safety, so she interpreted his attention through old evidence, not new context. Before that court collision, she could avoid royal notice and survive by staying low. After it, she could not disappear because the king had opened her file himself. Evo delivered relocation orders by dusk. Crown guest quarters inside the lower palace ring, restricted movement for protection pending inquiry. He spoke with formal respect and no softness, the tone of a man who believed rules existed to stop kingdoms from bleeding out. Corvus packed her satchel expecting interrogation. The assigned rooms had lockable windows, a desk stocked with blank paper, and guard rotations outside that shifted every 4 hours, an absurd level of detail for a designationless courier. She read it as surveillance. The audience could read it as the first crack in Drake's mask, a protective response disproportionate to her political value at that point. Over the next week, the investigation widened, and each widening forced another decision. Drake requested route logs only Corvus had seen, which required interviewing her repeatedly. He could have delegated entirely to clerks. He attended 2 of those sessions in person, asked short, precise questions, and dismissed everyone when officials tried to speak over her. She mistook that for control. The pattern underneath was interest sharpened by restraint he did not enjoy. A brief shift into his perspective belonged here, because this was the moment his history surfaced. Drake had spent 7 years training himself into emotional neutrality after his mother died during a prior designation fraud cover-up that officials labeled clerical error until bodies accumulated. He had built policy around verification, not trust, and that discipline kept him alive in a court where affection became leverage. Corvus naming forged seals without bargaining for reward forced a memory he had locked down. The image of someone choosing truth in a room arranged to punish it, and when blades flashed in the archive, his body moved before thought, because he had already lived once with the cost of reacting too late. He recognized the quality before he admitted why it mattered. Back in Corvus's perception, palace life felt like breathing under glass. Lydia requested private audience within 2 days, arrived in widow blue silk she wore when performing concern, and told Corvus the investigation had already damaged family standing. She suggested confession to procedural mistakes, minor perjury, anything that could close inquiry before names climbed upward. Corvus asked what mistake Lydia wanted admitted. Lydia smiled and said designationless girls should be grateful for negotiated outcomes. Corvus refused to sign the prepared statement. That refusal resolved one hesitation clearly. Corvus had hesitated to confront Lydia directly because family retaliation could remove her from independent status entirely. Signing would have protected short-term survival. Refusing made full inquiry possible and made Lydia an active enemy in the open. Within 4 days, forged correspondence surfaced linking Corvus to border agitators, letters supposedly carried during her courier routes, each stamped with copied Thornwood household wax. The accusation shifted from irregular testimony to treason facilitation. Kieran gave a careful statement about regrettable influences and the burden of difficult daughters. Corvus read it from a posted transcript and felt the old wound settle into certainty. He had chosen reputation over her again, this time in writing. The Crown scheduled Moon Archive hearing to verify originals, since that chamber held master ledgers and transfer chains for all 9 packs. Etta Voss, Palace Archivist, was assigned record custodian for the session. Corvus met her once before the hearing and saw fear on Etta's face when the woman handled Thornwood birth volumes, fear that looked older than this case. Etta whispered that local clerks held ledgers before central transfer, and if someone controlled first entries long enough, whole bloodline narratives could be rewritten by the time they reached capital shelves. She refused to say more without sovereign protection for testimony. The hearing day arrived under snow and iron sky, and the attack happened exactly when Etta opened Transfer Packet Index 17. 2 assassins disguised as copy clerks moved from opposite flanks, one toward Etta, one toward Corvus. The obstacle at that moment was ambiguity. No one could still pretend this was routine legal dispute once blades came out in a Crown archive. Drake's intervention and public claim resolved that hesitation in one stroke, because emergency sovereign custody moved Corvus from contestable witness to protected crown person, impossible to remand to local jurisdiction without his direct reversal. The cost appeared immediately. By claiming her publicly, Drake triggered succession and treaty alarms among elite houses that had planned a dynastic match with him to secure border stability. The loudest bloc was Grayfen Accord, two eastern border pacts, whose militia support depended on a pre-arranged royal engagement to Lady Marrow Vane. That engagement had never become personal. It existed as treaty machinery, and machinery still counted when winter raids rose. Council members called emergency session before midnight. Some demanded claim suspension pending sanity review, a ritual insult used when kings chose outside expected hierarchy. Corvus stayed in protected quarters while the palace argued about her body as legal instrument. She heard enough through thin stone and careless servants to understand two facts. His claim had shielded her from immediate arrest. His claim had also turned her into a permanent political target attached to his weakest flank. She assumed strategy again, because the alternative, that he had chosen this cost for her specifically, felt impossible against everything her life had taught. Drake visited near dawn, coat still carrying snowmelt and smoke from the chamber braziers. He said the claim remained in force. He said she would have armed escort on every movement. He said Ivo would brief her on revised threat protocol. Corvus asked if this was temporary until the archive dust settled. He held her gaze too long before answering, and when he did, he chose the king voice, stripped and controlled. My word is not temporary. He left before she could ask what that meant for either of them. Ivo became the practical bridge between decree and daily life. He assigned 3 rotating guard teams, moved Corvus to inner ring apartments, and submitted route restrictions she hated. Procedure irritated her because it felt like another cage, yet she started noticing when Ivo adjusted plans to include her consent where law did not require it. One afternoon in Training Yard Passage, a noble son laughed that the king had elevated courier stock for novelty. Ivo corrected him for contempt of protected crown person with the same calm tone he used for sword drills. The correction mattered because it showed institutional loyalty shifting from the letter of hierarchy to the enacted legality of her status. Pressure kept mounting, and Corvus's misread deepened under it. Drake's decisions looked like strategic containment to someone who had never been loved by power. He cut audience lists, barred Thornwood household from unsupervised contact, and reassigned 2 clerks who had handled her file. Each action protected her. Each action also felt like controlled distance. She told herself a king did not see women like her. He deployed them. The next major crack came during a closed evidence review, where Lydia appeared as voluntary witness. Lydia performed sorrow beautifully, described Corvus as unstable since failed designation right, and implied resentment made her susceptible to manipulation by anti-crown actors. Corvus stayed silent until Lydia mentioned their mother and claimed maternal concern had always favored Lydia's steadiness. Something in Corvus gave way. She interrupted and said their mother died apologizing for not stopping the 2016 humiliation because she had been too weak by then to stand against pack politics. Lydia slapped her across the face before anyone moved. Drake stood so fast his chair overturned. He did not shout. He ordered Lydia removed in a voice so cold the entire room backed away from both sisters. He suspended Thornwood household privileges pending treason inquiry, including Kieran's council access until further review. The decision cost him procedural capital, because pre-hearing sanctions against a council family looked like bias. He made it anyway, in front of witnesses. Corvus touched her stinging cheek and finally saw something that did not match her contempt theory. That reaction had been personal. She still could not assemble the full meaning, and the story kept forcing movement before she could sit with any of it. Etta requested protected audience and delivered the first concrete break in the case. Thornwood birth ledgers showed 2 parallel entries for Corvus. One original noting no designation marker at birth. One later, Overwrite classifying delayed omega onset with administrative correction code used for clerical cleanup. ETA produced ink age tests proving overwrite occurred months after entry and before central transfer, and she stated under oath that this was not a biological defect corrected by later evidence. It was deliberate archival suppression, designed to remove a designationless child from bloodline calculations. She admitted she had noticed anomalies years earlier and stayed silent because previous archivists who raised similar concerns about noble bloodline manipulations disappeared during audit season. Etta's confession resolved a key obstacle directly. Before she testified, Corvus could allege tampering without proof chain. After Etta released transfer metadata, deliberate suppression became prosecutable fact, and the case could move from rumor warfare to formal treason proceedings. Corvus sought Drake that night in the strategy gallery overlooking frozen courtyard drills. She asked why he had reacted the way he did when hearing she was designationless. He stayed silent long enough that she almost withdrew the question. He said his mother had tried to expose designation fraud tied to succession contracts when he was 24. She died before hearing, carriage brakes cut on black ice outside Grafin Pass, and the inquiry report called it winter misfortune, despite tool marks found later in the carriage bay. He had spent 7 years emotionally disengaged because attachment made leverage points, and leverage points got people buried. Corvus understood his wound in the body first, in the way his hands stayed open and empty while he spoke, as if proving he carried no weapon into that confession. He said designation fraud had never been about scent science. It had been about who qualified as marriage currency inside elite blocks. A child with no designation disrupted arranged pathways, so records erased anomalies and reassigned categories that kept treaty markets tidy. He looked at her and said his investigation had begun as governance necessity. Somewhere during the first week, it had stopped being only that. The almost moment happened there, suspended between statement and touch. Corvus stepped closer, willing to believe for one reckless second that this was not strategy, and an alarm bell rang from the lower court because a messenger from Grafin arrived with treaty ultimatum. The window closed before either of them crossed it. The ultimatum delivered the apparent impossibility. Grafin Accord demanded restoration of dynastic engagement terms within 10 days, or withdrawal of winter militia support from eastern borderlines. Raiders had tested those lines twice that month. Counselors argued no king could jeopardize frontier lives for an unverified mate claim tied to scandal. Drake ordered mobilization plans independent of Grafin, a move that strained treasury and logistics immediately. Corvus read the strategic brief and saw the cost in hard numbers of supplies and troop rotations. Her existence had become measurable risk for people who had never met her. She made a decision that night and left a signed request to relinquish claim status, offering voluntary exile to neutral monastery territory in exchange for treaty stabilization. The hesitation she resolved was her belief that she had no agency inside his decisions. Writing that request proved she could act even in the center of his power, though the action hurt. Ivo intercepted her at the north gate before dawn, request still in his hand, expression unreadable. He said she had legal right to petition. He said leaving under threat active would classify as security breach and could trigger pursuit protocols she would hate. He offered one alternative: attend final evidentiary session and speak her own position before any relinquishment considered. Corvus agreed because she had not fought this long to disappear into someone else's summary. Final hearings opened in early 2025 under armed guard and packed galleries. Lydia entered in white this time, a choice signaling innocence claim, and Kieran sat behind her as character witness until the first evidence block dismantled both. Etta testified for 3 hours, precise and unsparing, mapping ledger alterations across 19 years tied to bloodline committee directives, where Kieran's signature appeared on transfer recommendations. She explained how designation rights functioned as binding customs socially, while remaining biologically uncertain, a gap manipulators exploited by treating custom outcome as destiny in public record. Lydia's defense tried to argue administrative normalization, not malice. Etta produced correspondence proving Lydia had requested accelerated correction codes for Corvus's file 2 weeks before the 2016 write, anticipating failure and preparing social downgrade documents to protect Lydia's arranged bloodline ascent in the Thornwood dynastic slate. Corvus's continued legal ambiguity threatened that ascent, and the forged path removed the obstacle. Corvus watched Lydia read the letter projected on court crystal and felt no triumph. Only the heavy clarity that some betrayals were so deliberate they ended all ambiguity. Kieran attempted to distance himself, claiming he signed committee bundles without detail review. Drake personally questioned him on counsel duty standards until Kieran admitted knowing irregularities and choosing silence to preserve Thornwood negotiating position. The hearing paused at midday for royal determination on treaty conflict. Grayfin emissaries stood ready with withdrawal papers unless Drake reversed claim and recommitted dynastic engagement by sundown. Council asked for recess recommendation. Drake rose and stated he would not dissolve a lawful claim made under attack and affirmed Corvus's legitimacy as crownmate candidate pending her consent. He signed military replacement orders accepting Grayfin withdrawal risk and cancelled engagement framework publicly. That was his costly choice in concrete terms. He gave up a key alliance that had stabilized one border treaty bloc and accepted immediate strategic weakness to uphold her legitimacy. No one in that chamber could recast it as convenience. Corvus still had a choice of her own, and the court made sure she understood the stakes. Chief Justice asked whether she accepted bond continuation knowing permanent visibility would follow, including heightened assassination risk and political hostility from houses invested in bloodline hierarchy. Corvus looked at the benches where girls from unranked households stood as clerks and assistants, girls who had watched her humiliation years earlier and were watching this now. She said she accepted the bond by her own will. She said she did not mistake protection for ownership. She said she chose him with full knowledge that being publicly chosen could turn every day into defense work. That statement resolved her central wound with action, not sentiment. In 2016, she had been publicly rejected while people looked away. In 2025, she publicly chose and was chosen in a room that could not look away, reversing the injury at the same social scale where it was inflicted. His alliance sacrifice and her voluntary acceptance happened as separate costly choices after the attack, ending the last doubt that the public claim had been strategy only. Sentencing followed before dusk. Lydia was convicted of treasonous record manipulation and conspiracy to commit lethal suppression of a crown witness, sentence commuted from death to permanent exile at the outer border pack of Hallowmere, under oath silence gies. No inheritance rights, no court return. The ruling named motive directly. She had manipulated Corvus's record to preserve her arranged ascent through bloodline politics, and that finding stripped any remaining pretense of sisterly duty from her case. She left the chamber without looking at Corvus once, escorted by 4 guards through the east corridor that led toward winter caravans. Kieran was stripped of council seat and household voting privileges for life, allowed to retain personal holdings under supervision because his cooperation after confrontation reduced active sabotage risk. He tried to speak to Corvus in the hall. She declined and kept walking. Etta Voss was reinstated as chief registrar with expanded archive authority and independent guard detail. Drake signed archival reform edicts the same week, central transfer required within 48 hours of birth registration across all 9 packs, dual clerk verification, and public challenge windows for designation records before right age. Designation rights remained binding custom in social ceremony, exactly as tradition held, and law now recognized that custom did not override verifiable biological uncertainty or permit administrative coercion. This legal shift mattered because it prevented future families from weaponizing paperwork against children who complicated political plans. Evo's final procedural act became personal in its own quiet way. During the first court session after sentencing, he approached Corvus before entry, offered the formal salute reserved for lawful future queen consort, and addressed her by full title without hesitation. His loyalty had begun as obedience to statute. It had become recognition of the person statute now protected. Corvus returned the salute because respect felt strongest when reciprocated, not absorbed. Public claiming ceremony took place at Thaw Break in the same shrine court where her 2016 rite had collapsed. Drake insisted on that location despite advisor objections about optics. Corvus stood again in white linen, older by years that had felt longer than 20 should contain, and this time the crowd held both nobles and labor households under equal summons. Drake spoke brief vows in the language of command softened by intention, promising protection without erasure and partnership without concealment. Corvus answered with her own, promising truth even when truth complicated crown convenience. He marked her publicly with sovereign mate seal at wrist, ceremonial and legal, witnessed by council, clergy, and pack delegates. The mark did not erase risk. It changed what risk meant. Attacking her now meant attacking the king's declared center. People who once used her invisibility as a weapon could no longer pretend she existed outside consequence. Private life did not become simple because romantic fulfillment in their world was never built on simplicity. It became honest. Corvus moved into upper ring apartments with workroom access, continued reviewing courier integrity protocols by choice, and joined Reform Council sessions where lower rank testimony had historically been filtered out. Drake kept his short declarative speech in public. In private, he asked more than ordered, a shift so small outsiders missed it and so large she felt it every day. He slept lightly from old habit, waking at corridor sounds. She learned his worst nights came after carriage wheels on frozen roads echoed in the courtyard. She learned why he had moved on instinct in the archive before anyone else understood the threat, because grief had trained that reflex into him years before she met him. He learned hers came before public ceremonies where too many eyes turned at once. They met each other there without performance. One evening in late spring, Corvus requested a visit to the old 2016 Rite Hall after hours. She had avoided it since the new ceremony, because crowds made bravery easier than solitude did. The hall smelled of cedar smoke and wet stone. She stood where she had stood at 12 and remembered the exact pressure of waiting for a mark that never came while people decided what that absence allowed them to do to her. Drake stayed a step behind, no touch until she reached back for him first. She told him she no longer wanted that memory to be the loudest one in this room. He said it would not be, and this time his certainty felt like shelter, not command. Summer session brought the first test of their new order when a minor pack petitioned to challenge a child's designation record under the reform statute. Council conservatives expected delay tactics. Corvus chaired preliminary review and ruled immediate evidentiary hearing, citing exactly the loophole once used against her. Drake backed the ruling without amendment. That decision signaled the reforms were not symbolic concessions tied to one scandal. They were operating law. Rumor networks shifted slower than law. Some houses still called her designationless in tones meant to reduce her. She started answering plainly, yes, and the kingdom survives it. The phrase spread, stripped of insult by repetition. Younger clerks began using designation-neutral forms in draft registries before mandates required them. Cultural drift had begun, and even those who disliked it had to speak in the new grammar to keep influence. Corvus saw Lydia one last time at departure transfer yard, exile convoy preparing for Hallamir. Lydia asked if this victory felt worth becoming hunted forever. Corvus answered that she had been hunted while powerless too. Only then no one admitted it was happening. Lydia laughed once, hollow and tired, and said Corvus had always mistaken stubbornness for virtue. Corvus said maybe, and climbed down from the wagon step before guards could call the exchange disorderly. She walked away, without needing the last word. Kieran faded from court life fast once title went. He sent 3 letters in the first month, all beginning with practical concerns about estate management and none with apology. Corvus returned the first unopened, archived the second for legal record, burned the third in her study brazier. Closure came from action, not reconciliation performance. By first snowfall after the hearings, the palace had settled into a rhythm where her presence no longer triggered every whispered aside. Children from service families ran through west corridors and bowed to her because protocol taught them, then asked if wolves chose names before or after first shift, because curiosity usually outran etiquette at that age. Corvus answered their questions seriously. She remembered what it meant to grow up hearing only hierarchy explanations. Drake remained a king formed by power, still dangerous when needed, still economical with mercy toward those who harmed his people. The difference lay in where his authority rested now. He no longer treated attachment as a breach to be patched. He treated it as territory to defend openly. During a late council dispute over budget reallocations for archive guards, a senior lord implied the reforms were sentimental overcorrection tied to queen consort influence. Drake replied that the kingdom had spent decades paying in blood for records men called administrative. He approved the allocation and moved to next agenda item: no raised voice, no room for appeal. One final brief look from his perspective belonged at the end. 7 years of emotional disengagement had felt like competence to him until Corvus interrupted a rigged sentencing and made truth expensive in front of everyone. He had not planned to choose anyone. Planning had never protected the people he loved. Choosing anyway, with full view of cost, became the first act in years that felt like ruling rather than surviving. Their fulfilled union did not erase the world's hardness. It changed who stood against that hardness together. Corvus, born in 2004, once filed as late onset pending and treated as expendable by her own family, stood at winter convocation as publicly claimed queen consort before delegates of all 9 packs. Drake, 31 when they collided in Frost Court at her age 20, stood beside her and did not hide what she was to him. Etta read annual archive compliance with steady hands. Ivo announced security without flinching at her name in the same breath as the king's. When convocation ended, Corvus stayed in the empty hall a moment longer, listening to the echoes thin out under vaulted stone. She remembered the girl from 2016 who thought public attention only arrived to humiliate, and she let that memory sit beside the present without trying to erase either one. Drake joined her, offered his hand, and waited. She took it and walked with him into the corridor where guards, clerks, and servants bowed without confusion over where she belonged. The wound had been answered at the exact level where it was made. The king had chosen her in a way no one could argue away, and she had chosen him with equal clarity, with cost counted and accepted, which was the only version of forever either of them would have trusted.